The air was heavy with silence, as the farmer stood on the shining runway, his eyes fixed on the massive white jet, gleaming in the afternoon sun. The polished silver wings seemed almost unreal, like a dream too big for someone who had worked the soil with blistered hands his whole life. Yet here it was so close that he could almost touch it, but the silence around him was not a silence of admiration. It was the silence of judgment, whispers moving behind his back like snakes in dry grass. The salesman in the crisp blue suit kept a smile on his face, but that smile carried no warmth. It was the kind of smile that said, "You do not belong here." His polished shoes clicked against the runway as he walked closer, pretending to adjust the papers. On his clipboard, his eyes flickered once at the farmer's boots, cracked from years of work in the fields, then flickered back up quickly, as though the sight had burned him. The farmer did not move. His face was calm, but inside his chest his heart beat like a drum. He could feel every stare from the group of businessmen standing a few yards away. They had arrived in luxury cars, polished black vehicles that reflected the sunlight. They spoke in low voices, yet the farmer knew those voices were about him, the outsider, the man who had come here thinking he had the right to buy a jet. The farmer's hands tightened around his hat, sweat sliding down his temple. He was not ashamed of his clothes, not ashamed of the dirt under his nails, because every mark told the story of survival. Every scar was proof that he had faced droughts, storms, and losses that would have broken weaker men. He had come here not to ask for permission, but to claim what he had worked for. Yet the way they looked at him twisted something deep inside. The first words came from one of the businessmen, tall, broad-shouldered, his tie shining red like blood. He laughed, though nothing had been said, and his laugh cut through the silence like a blade. "So you mean to tell me this is the buyer?" His words were loud enough for everyone to hear. The group chuckled quietly, but the laugh of the tall man was harsh, raw, filled with disbelief. The farmer raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting the tall man's without a blink. "Yes, I am the buyer." His voice was low, steady, carrying weight, like the ground itself. He did not shout, he did not explain, he simply stated truth. For a moment the laughter died, the tall man's grin faltered, but then another man spoke, his words sharper. "Then knives, and what exactly are you going to do with a jet, friend? Carry bales of hay across the skymoor?" Laughter burst out, this time louder, crueler, every chuckle echoing against the steel of the jet, as though the machine itself had joined in. The insult. The salesman cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable. "Gentlemen, please. This is a serious inquiry." He looked at the farmer with a mask of politeness, but in his eyes lay doubt and something darker. The farmer could see it, the same look he had seen 1,000 times when walking into banks, stores, or restaurants, a look that questioned his worth without words. There, farmer kept his silence. He knew anger would only feed them, but silence was its own weapon. Still, the storm inside him grew because he remembered every time he had been turned away, every door that had been shut, every deal that had slipped from his grasp. Not because of money, not because of merit, but because of something he could never change: the color of his skin. He thought of his family waiting back at the farm, his wife, who had cried the day he told her about the jet, not tears of sadness, but of disbelief and pride. She had said, "You did it. You truly did it." He thought of his son, wide-eyed at the idea that his father would one day fly in the sky like the men in magazines, and he thought of his own father, long buried, who had told him once, "Never stop dreaming, even when they laugh, even when they tell you no." Those voices now filled his head, mixed with the cruel laughter in front of him, and he felt the weight of history pressing down. But he stood taller, placing his hat firmly under his arm. "I am here to buy this jet," he repeated calmly, the words like steel in his mouth, "and you will sell it to me because my money is as real as any man." Said group went quiet then, as if stunned by his boldness. Even the tall man's smirk faded, replaced by something darker, something more dangerous, the kind of silence before a storm when the air grows heavy and every bird vanishes into the trees. Finally the salesman gestured awkwardly toward the office building on the side of the airstrip. "Sir, if you would come inside, we can discuss financing." The farmer walked forward, his boots thudding against the smooth ground, each step a declaration of existence. But as he moved past the businessmen, he felt one of them lean close and whisper words meant only for him, words soaked in venom: "You will never be one of us." The farmer did not flinch. He did not stop, but those words dug into his chest like nails, because he knew they did not see him as a man with dreams or wealth or rights. They saw him only as someone who had dared to step beyond the boundaries drawn for him long before he was born. Inside The office, the walls gleamed with glass and chrome. The salesman spread out the papers, his hands trembling slightly, though his voice tried to remain smooth. "We will need confirmation of your funds," he said. Of course, the farmer replied he had prepared every document, every receipt, every record of his success, because he had known this moment would come. He placed the folder on the desk, the thick stack of proof, heavy as stone. The salesman flipped through slowly, his smile growing thinner with every page. He could not deny the truth. The farmer had the means, and more than enough, yet something in his eyes remained restless, unwilling. The silence stretched until finally the farmer asked, "Is there a problem?" The salesman hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, no problem at all," but his tone betrayed the lie outside. The businessmen were still gathered, their faces pressed against the glass like predators waiting for a crack in the shield, their whispers like smoke slipping under the door. Farmer straightened his back, his voice firm. "Let us proceed then," but inside he knew the battle was only beginning. He could feel it like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. And as the pen touched the paper to sign the first line, a phone rang. Sharp, loud, slicing through the room. The salesman froze, lifted the receiver, listened for a long moment. Then his face changed, pale as chalk. He hung up slowly, his hand trembling. "Sir," he said quietly, "there has been a complication." The farmer stared at him. "What complication?" His voice steady, though inside his stomach churned. The salesman swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the glass where the businessmen still lingered. "Someone has raised a challenge to the sale," he whispered. "Someone important." The words hung in the air, heavy, cold, like a blade pressed against the throat. The farmer's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. He knew then that this was no ordinary sale. It was a fight, not just for a jet, but for dignity, for respect, for every man who had ever been told, "You do not belong here." And as the weight of that truth sank into the room, the door creaked open. Slowly, shadows stretching across the floor. Part 1 ends here, with the storm waiting to break. The door opened, slowly, and the air in the office shifted, cold, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The farmer did not turn. Immediately he wanted to finish signing the page, but the weight of the presence behind him forced his hand to freeze mid-stroke. He raised his head and saw a man step inside, tall, lean, wearing a dark gray suit that shimmered faintly under the fluorescent light, his eyes sharp, calculating, like a hawk circling prey. The salesman straightened nervously, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, I did not expect to hear so soon." The man in the gray suit ignored him, his gaze locked on the farmer, as though nothing else existed. He walked forward, slowly, each step precise, controlled, a predator that never rushed. "So, this is the buyer," he said, his voice smooth but cold like polished steel. The farmer met his gaze without fear. "Yes, I am," he replied. The man's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile, more like a warning. "I am afraid there has been a change of plans," he said. The farmer set the pen down gently, his hands steady, though inside he could feel his heart slam against his ribs. "What kind of change?" he asked calmly. The man leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping low enough that only the farmer could hear. "You see, this jet was never meant for you," he said softly, the words dripping with poison. The salesman shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," he began, but the man in the gray suit raised a hand, silencing him without a glance. Then he looked back at the farmer. "You may have the money, you may have the papers, but money is not the only price here. Influence matters, connections matter, and decide who flies and who does not." The farmer stared at him, unblinking. "I have earned this jet with my work, with my sweat, with my years of labor. I have more than enough to pay, and you have no reason to deny me." The man's smile widened cruelly. "Reason," he said, "reason is whatever. I choose it to be outside the window." The businessmen were still gathered, watching with hungry eyes, like wolves waiting for blood, their laughter faint but sharp, carried by the wind. Even through the thick glass the farmer felt it pierce his chest. Farmer leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy with restrained fire. "You cannot stop me. I have proof. I have rights. You cannot twist this into a game." The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, stronger perhaps. "You are right. Perhaps I cannot stop you alone, but I am not alone." He stepped back, snapping his fingers once to more men entered the room, their suits identical, their expressions hard as stone. They carried no weapons, but their presence was weapon enough. The salesman's hands trembled visibly now, his papers shaking on the desk. "Sir," he whispered, "perhaps we should reschedule this discussion." The farmer rose slowly from his chair, his broad frame filling the room like a mountain, his eyes locked on the man in gray. "I will not reschedule," he said. "I will not leave this place until this Jet, his mind. The room went still. The salesman froze. The two men in suits shifted slightly, unsure. The man in grey tilted his head, studying the farmer with eyes that gleamed with both amusement and malice. "Very well," he said. "If you wish to fight, then let us fight. But remember, this is not your world. You walk on soil that rejects youth." Farmer did not reply. He reached down, calmly picked up the pen, and signed the paper in one strong stroke. The ink black and permanent, the sound of the pen against the paper echoing like thunder in the silent room. The salesman gasped softly, his eyes wide. The contract was signed, legally binding, undeniable. The farmer set the pen down, his hand steady, his face unreadable. But then the man in grey stepped forward, his hand sweeping across the desk with sudden force, knocking the papers to the ground. The salesman flinched back, the sound of fluttering pages filling the room. Like wings of trapped birds, the farmer did not flinch. He simply stared at the man in grey, his silence heavier than any words. "You think ink makes you powerful," the man sneered. "You think signatures will protect you, but ink fades, paper burns, and men like me, we control the fire." He leaned closer, his voice low, deadly. "This jet will never lift you into the sky, it will bury you in the ground." The farmer's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the office door burst open again. This time not with suited men, but with a woman, tall, dressed in black, her hair tied back, sharp features blazing with fury. She walked straight past the others, her eyes locked on the man in grey. "Enough," she snapped, her voice cutting like glass. "Enough of your games. This man has every right to this purchase. You will not deny him." The room froze. The man in grey's smile faltered. The two men in suits glanced at each other, uncertain. The salesman blinked rapidly, as though trying to process what thought was unfolding. The farmer turned to the woman, his brow furrowing. "Who are you?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes soft but fierce. "I am the legal director for this company," she said, "and I will not allow corruption to stain our name." The man in grey laughed cold, bitter, his smile sharp. "So the board sent you," he said. Her jaw tightened. "Yes, they did, and I will not allow you to sabotage this deal." The farmer felt a surge of something deep inside. Not relief, not yet, but something close, a flicker of hope. But it was fleeting, because he knew battles like this were never won with one voice. The man in grey stepped closer to her, his smile vanishing, his voice cold. "Do you know what you are doing?" he asked. "You are siding with him against me." "Against us." She did not back down. "Yes," she said firmly, "and if you stand in the way of justice, I will make sure everyone knows." For a moment, silence, thick, heavy. The man in grey's face twisted with restrained rage. Then he turned sharply to the farmer. "This is not over," he said, his voice like a curse. "You may think you have won, but you will pay for this." He stormed out, his men following close behind, the door slamming shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The room remained silent for several long seconds, until finally the salesman bent down, gathering the scattered papers, his hands still shaking. He glanced up at the farmer, his voice unsteady. "Sir, it seems we can continue the process after all." The farmer nodded slowly, but inside his heart was still pounding, because he knew this victory was fragile, temporary, like a single candle flickering in the wind. The woman in black placed a hand gently on the papers, steadying them, her eyes meeting the farmer's. "You are not alone," she said quietly, but her voice carried weight. "Still, you must be careful. They will not stop here. They never do." The farmer studied her face, searching for deception, but found none, her eyes clear, unwavering. He gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once firmly, then turned to the salesman. "Finish this," she ordered. The salesman swallowed hard and began arranging the documents. Again his voice quiet but obedient. "Yes, ma'am." Farmer signed each page, slowly, deliberately, every stroke of ink, another step closer to his dream. Every signature, a shield against those who wished to strip it away. But even as he signed, he could feel shadows pressing against the walls, waiting for the chance to strike again. And when the last page was signed, the woman took the stack and held it tightly in her hands, her eyes fierce. "This is done," she said. But even as she spoke, the farmer knew, deep in his chest, that the war was only beginning. He stepped outside into the fading light, the jet gleaming before him like a promise, but behind him in the glass windows he saw the reflection of the businessmen, still gathered, their eyes burning with quiet rage, their smiles sharp as knives. The farmer stood tall, his hat in his hands, the cool wind brushing his face. He had taken the first step, but as he gazed at the sky, he knew the storm had only just begun. Part 2 ends here with the fire of revenge smoldering in the shadows, unseen. The sun had slipped lower in the sky when the farmer left the office. the warmth fading into a cool, sharp wind that brushed against his face. The jet still stood gleaming on the runway, but now it looked different, not just a dream of flight, but a target for every eye that burned against him from the shadows. The group of businessmen had not dispersed. They lingered near their polished cars, their voices low, their faces turned toward him with expressions that carried no disguise. They did not laugh this time. They did not mock. Their silence was heavier than words, a silence filled with plans. The farmer walked past them, his boots steady, his shoulders straight. He refused to show fear, yet each step was weighed down by the storm he knew was coming. The contract was signed, the deal complete in ink and law, but law had never stopped hatred before. When he reached his truck, he paused, his hand resting on the door, his eyes scanning the horizon, the sky painted in deep purples and golds, birds cutting through the fading light. He thought of his family back at the farm, waiting, unaware of the fire that now followed him like a shadow. He had wanted to surprise them with joy, to return home with triumph, but instead, he carried a warning in his chest, a whisper of danger as he drove the long road back to the farm, the hum of the engine steady, the wheels eating up the miles. His mind replayed the face of the man in the grey suit, the way his eyes had glimmered with malice, the way his words had carried promises of destruction. This was not finished, not by a long measure. The farmhouse came into view, warm lights glowing in the windows, the smell of dinner drifting on the breeze as he stepped out. His wife hurried to the porch, her smile wide, her arms open, her eyes shining with hope. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice trembling. He paused only for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Yes, it is done," she cried, then tears streaming down her face as she pressed her forehead against his chest, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I knew you could." I knew. He held her tight, his eyes closing for a moment, drawing strength from her warmth, from her belief, but he could not tell her of the shadows not yet inside. His son sat at the table, his eyes wide when he heard the words, "It is ours." The boy leaped up, shouting with joy, his laughter filling the room like sunlight. "Father, we will fly," he said one day. "We will fly above the fields, above the clouds." The farmer smiled, but it was a smile carved with effort, because though he wanted to share his son's innocence, he felt the weight of what was yet to come. That night sleep would not come. The farmer lay awake, listening to the wind press against the windows, his wife's steady breathing beside him, his son's quiet dreams down the hall, but his own eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling, because he knew men like the one in grey did not give up. They struck when the world was quiet, when the victim was unguarded. He was right at dawn. The first blow came not to his body but to his name when he drove into town for supplies. Whispers followed him. Merchants who had greeted him with smiles the week before now avoided his eyes. Some offered clipped words, others nothing at all. He saw two men at the corner store leaning close, their voices low, but their eyes fixed on him with cold amusement. By midday he learned why the papers printed in bold letters accusations, twisted lies, rumors that he had used false documents, that he had stolen funds, that he was not a man of success but of deceit. It was a story crafted not to prove but to poison, and the poison spread quickly. When he stepped into the bank later that afternoon, the manager refused to meet his gaze, refused even to shake his hand, his voice cold. "The matter of your account is under review, sir." The farmer stood tall, his voice steady. "You know the truth. You have seen every record." The manager shifted uneasily, but the fear in his eyes was not of truth, it was of pressure from powers larger than him. The farmer left the building, each step heavy, his jaw tight. He knew this was no coincidence. This was the backlash promised by the man in grey. This was Warby evening. Another blow came, his phone buzzing with messages from suppliers, contracts he had held for years, suddenly cancelled, excuses, thin words about delays, about complications, but the meaning clear. He was being cut off, isolated, strangled, not with fists but with invisible hands tightening around his throat. At dinner, his wife noticed his silence, her eyes searching his face. "What is it?" she asked. "What has happened?" He hesitated. The truth thick in his throat. He did not want to break the fragile joy that still shone in her eyes, yet he could not lie. "They are coming for us," he said quietly. "They will not let this be easy." She reached across the table, her hand covering hers, warm, strong. "Then let them come," she whispered. "We have faced storms before. We will face this too." He looked at her, eyes filled with fire, and he drew strength again, though the storm outside was only growing. That night, the second attack came not in whispers but in action. He woke to the sound of barking, the dogs outside. Frantic, he grabbed the lantern, stepped onto the porch, and froze in the dark. The barn glowed faint orange flames licking the wooden beams, the fire crackling louder with each second he ran across the yard, his heart pounding the heat already fierce. He grabbed the hose, but the flames were too strong, too fast. Years of harvest equipment, tools, memories all consumed in fire. His son's voice behind him crying, "Father, Father." He shielded the boy with one arm, his eyes fixed on the inferno. Neighbors arrived, but too late. Buckets of water splashed but could not tame the blaze. By dawn the barn was nothing but ash. The sheriff came scribbling notes, his eyes weary, his words empty. "Probably an accident," he said, but the farmer knew better. He had seen the shadow of a man running into the trees. When he first arrived he had smelled the smoke of hatred. Not accident. His wife stood by him, her face pale, her lips trembling, but she did not cry. She looked at the ashes, then at him, and said, "This is only the beginning." He nodded, his jaw like stone. "Yes, this is only the beginning." As the sun rose on the ruined farm, he stood with his family, his son clutching his sleeve, his wife gripping his hand behind him. The ashes still smoked before him. The sky stretched wide, endless, the jet gleaming in his mind, not as a luxury now, but as a symbol of defiance. He would not back down, he could not back down, but as he stared into the horizon he felt the weight of the battle pressing heavier than ever, because this was no longer about a purchase. It was about survival, it was about dignity. It was about showing a world that had always told him no, that he would never stop fighting until he carved a yes. The storm had broken and the first flames had come, but he knew darker nights were waiting, nights filled with betrayal, nights filled with pain. Yet inside his chest the fire burned stronger than the ashes that smoldered at his feet. And so part 3 ends with the farmer standing at the edge of ruin, yet holding firm, knowing the war had only just begun. The ashes of the barn still smoked when the farmer rose the next morning, his hands blackened with soot, his face hollow from sleepless hours. The land smelled of charred wood and loss, but beneath the weight of grief his spirit hardened like iron. His wife moved quietly, preparing what little food remained. His son sat silent, staring at the ruins, his young eyes learning too soon the cruelty of the world. The farmer knew he could not waste time. Grief could wait, but survival could not. He drove into town with his truck, its tires crunching gravel as though carrying the weight of every loss. The streets were busy, but people shifted away. When he walked by, their eyes sliding off him as if he were invisible, or worse, cursed. He carried his head high, refusing to bow, though inside the burn of betrayal seared deeper than the fire that had taken his barn. At the supply store, the owner, who had once greeted him with warmth, now looked uneasy, his hands fidgeting with papers behind the counter. "We cannot serve you today," he muttered, his voice thin. The farmer placed his calloused hands on the counter, his eyes steady. "Why not?" The man swallowed his throat. "Bobbing orders," he said. Orders from above. The farmer left without another word, but rage pulsed in his chest like a drum. This was no accident, this was coordinated. He could see the threads pulling together, weaving a net to strangle him. On the way back, his truck slowed near the gas station where 3 men leaned against a black sedan, their suits sharp, their eyes colder than winter. One of them raised a cigarette to his lips and smirked as the farmer drove past, calling out loud enough to carry, "Stay on the ground, farmer, the sky is not for you." Laughter followed, sharp, cruel, cutting through the wind. The farmer gripped the wheel tighter, but did not stop, because he knew that was what they wanted. They wanted his fury to boil over, to give them excuse to strike harder. When he reached home, his wife met him on the porch, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What happened?" she asked. Softly he shook his head. "They're closing every door." She pressed her lips together, her eyes hard with quiet fire. "Then we break through walls," she whispered. "We do not stop." That evening a visitor came, the woman in black, who had stood for him at the office, her car pulling into the dusty yard. She stepped out, her heels sinking into the dirt, but her stride firm, her eyes scanning the ruins of the barn with silent understanding. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, her voice low. The farmer studied her face, suspicion still flickering, but trust beginning to take root. "You knew this would happen," he said. She nodded. "Yes, men like him always strike back when they feel power slipped." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You must be careful. They are trying to ruin you legally, financially, socially, but when that fails they will not hesitate to ruin you physically." The farmer crossed his arms, his voice like stone. "Then let them come." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce but her words steady. "No, you cannot fight them head on. Not yet. You must be smarter than them." His wife appeared beside him, her hands crossed over her apron, her eyes sharp. "Why are you helping us?" she asked the woman. In Black's face softened for a moment. "Because I have seen too many men crushed under their boots," she said, "and I swore never again if I can stop it." The farmer gave a slow nod, a storm of thoughts raging in his chest. Part of him wanted to push her away, to trust no one, but another part knew he needed allies, and her courage had already been proven. That night they sat together around the kitchen table, the oil lamp, flickering shadows on the walls. The woman laying out documents, names of board members, whispers of corruption, hidden accounts, trails of power that linked back to the man in grey. "This is his strength," she said, tapping. "The paper is not just wealth, but fear. He controls men with secrets and debts." The farmer listened carefully, his son sitting quietly in the corner, his young face soaking in every word the boy spoke. Finally his voice, small but strong, "Father will beat them." The woman looked at him, her eyes soft. "And I will help him do it," she said. But even as hope flickered, a new blow arrived the next morning, when letters came, official, stamped cold, demanding sudden audits of the farm, sudden inspections, sudden threats of fines, each paper dripping with intimidation. The farmer spread them on the table, his hands steady, though his wife's voice trembled. "They will take everything," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "They will not." That afternoon he drove back to the city to meet with lawyers, only to find doors closed, one after another. Faces that had once smiled now turned cold, their voices the same rehearsed line, "We cannot take this case, too much risk." By evening he stood on the steps of the courthouse, alone, the sky above him dark clouds heavy with rain, the city lights cold in the distance, the storm breaking inside him. Then he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. He turned and saw the man in grey, his smile sharp as ever. "You fight hard," the man said, his voice smooth, "but you are only one man. One man cannot break an empire." The farmer's jaw tightened, his voice steady. "Maybe, but one man can plant a seed, and seeds grow into forests." The man in grey laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You will lose, and when you lose, you will be forgotten." The farmer stepped closer, his eyes burning. "Then remember this, when you fall, I will not forget you." For a moment their eyes locked, the storm between them heavy, electric. Then the man turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his laughter behind them. Rain began to fall, cold, sharp, soaking through the farmer's shirt, but he stood unmoving, his chest rising steady, because though the storm outside had begun, he knew that greater storm was still coming. When he returned home late, his wife met him at the door, her eyes wide with worry. "What did he say?" she asked. He looked at her, his face wet with rain, his voice calm. "He promised I would lose." Then she asked softly, "And you, what did you promise?" "I promised he would fall." That night thunder rolled over the land, shaking the windows. The boy woke from sleep, his small voice calling, "Father, father." The farmer entered his room, sitting by the bed, holding his son's hand. The boy whispered, "Will they burn us again?" The farmer's voice was steady. "No, they will not," he said, but inside his chest he wondered how much more they would try before the end. The next day the woman in black returned, bringing more papers, but also something heavier. She closed the door behind her, her face grim. "They are moving faster," she said. "I overheard plans whispered in the office. They will strike again soon, and this time it will not be property, it will be used." Silence fell over the kitchen. The farmer's wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, his son's eyes wide with fear. The farmer's own face calm like stone, but his fists clenched on the table. "Then let them come," he said again. But the woman shook her head. "No, we must move first. Part 4 ends here." With the storm gathering closer, the danger now not only to his dreams but to his very life. The warning from the woman in black echoed in the farmer's mind long after she left the house, her words heavy like thunder pressing on the walls. "They will strike again. This time it will be you." He moved through the evening with careful eyes, his hands steady but his spirit wound tight. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of wind at the window felt like the breath before the wife sensed it too. She prepared the house with quiet urgency, locking doors, keeping lamps low, guiding their son to bed with whispers of calm, though her own eyes betrayed the storm she carried inside. The boy asked, "Father, will they come tonight?" The farmer placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady, even as fire burned in his chest. "Perhaps," he said, "but if they do, they will find me ready." The night stretched long, heavy with silence. The dogs outside, restless, pacing, shadows shifting across the yard. The farmer sat at the table, a lantern flickering beside him. His shotgun leaned against the wall within reach, his hands folded together in front of him, not in prayer, but in patience. Near midnight, The silence broke. Tires crunching gravel in the distance, engines low, steady, not one vehicle but several. The farmer rose slowly, his wife appearing at his side, her eyes wide, her hand gripping his arm. He shook his head gently, telling her without words to stay back. He lifted the shotgun, his steps measured as he moved to the porch. Headlights appeared cutting across the dark. 4 cars lined along the road, their doors opening, shadows stepping out, men in suits, their faces hard, their movements sure. They walked as though they owned the night. One of them called out, his voice sharp, mocking, "Farmer, you should be asleep by now." The others chuckled low, cruel. The farmer stepped forward into the lantern glow, his shotgun resting steady in his hands, not raised but ready. "Leave my land," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, steady and cold. The men paused for a moment, surprise flickering, but then their leader laughed. "This sound ugly. You think you can scare us with that?" he said. "You think you can protect what is already gone?" They began to move closer, slow, deliberate, circling like wolves. The farmer's dogs barked, furiously straining against their chains, the air thick with threat. His wife stood in the doorway, holding their son close, her voice trembling but firm. "Go back," she called. "You have no right here." The leader's eyes gleamed cruelly. "Every right," he said. "This land is ours. The sky is ours. The ground beneath your feet is ours. You should have stayed where you belong." The farmer's jaw tightened, his voice iron. "No man owns me, and no man owns my scar." Leader sneered, then snapped his fingers. To men stepped forward, one carrying a canister of fuel, the other a rag, their intentions clear. They moved toward the barn, though only ashes remained. They meant to strike again, to send a message through destruction. The farmer raised the shotgun, now steady, his voice sharp. "One more step and you will not take another." The yard froze, silence heavy, thick. The men eyed each other, uncertain. The leader laughed again, but it was thinner now, less sure. He raised his hands mockingly. "Easy now, farmer. No need for rash actions." But the farmer did not lower the weapon, his voice heavy with years of pain and defiance. "Every action you have taken against me, every whisper, every lie, every flame has been meant to break me. But I will not break, not for you, not for any man you want to fight." "Then step closer and see how much fight I carry." The standoff stretched, the men shifting, uncertain, their courage faltering beneath the steel of his eyes. The leader scowled, his jaw tight. He spat into the dirt, then turned sharply back to the cars. "This is not finished," he growled, his voice thick with fury. "This is only the beginning." They retreated one by one, their engines roaring as the cars pulled away into the night, the dogs barking long after, until the sound of wheels faded into silence. Farmer lowered the shotgun, his hands steady, though his chest burned with the fire of battle not fought, but promised. His wife rushed to him, her eyes wet with fear. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. He shook his head. "No, but they will come again." She clung to him, trembling. "Then we will stand again," she said. The boy stepped forward, his small face fierce with young defiance. "Father, we are not afraid." The farmer looked down at him, pride swelling even in the storm. "You will never bow," he said softly, and the boy nodded. The rest of the night passed without sleep. They sat together, the lantern burning low, until dawn broke, the light spilling across the yard, illuminating the ashes of the barn, the cracked earth, the heavy tracks of tires, proof of the darkness that had stalked them. Later that morning the woman in black returned, her car pulling into the yard. She stepped out, her face pale when she saw the marks. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp. The farmer told her each detail, his words steady, his tone heavy with truth. Her face hardened. "Then we cannot wait any longer," she said. "They will escalate until nothing remains." She spread new papers on the table. "These are the records I found, proof of laundering, proof of intimidation, proof of crimes hidden under polished smiles." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "If we take this public, they will burn. But the risk is great. They will try to silence us before the truth spreads." The farmer studied the documents, his rough hands brushing the pages, his mind heavy with decision. He thought of his wife, his son, his land, his father's voice echoing in memory. "Never stop dreaming, even when they tell you no, even when they try to end you." His jaw tightened. "Then we take it public," he said. "Sir." Woman nodded, determination flashing. "Then I will arrange the meeting with the press," she said. "But be ready once this begins, there is no going back." That night the farmer sat alone on the porch, the stars cold above, the air sharp. He thought of the jet, still waiting, gleaming, untouched in the city hangar, a symbol not just of flight, but of every dream denied, every door closed, every chain wrapped around his spirit. He thought of the man in gray, His words, sharp as knives, "You will lose." He clenched his fists, his voice low, steady, "I will rise." The following day they drove together to the city, the farmer, his wife, his son, the woman in black, her car carrying them toward a storm larger than flames, larger than whispers. When they arrived at the press hall, cameras already waited, journalists buzzing, eager for a story. The woman handed the farmer the papers, her voice steady. "This is your voice now. Speak and they will hear." He stepped forward, his boots echoing against the polished floor, the cameras turning, the flashes sharp. He laid the papers before the journalists, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "I am here because truth has been buried under lies, because power has been used not to protect but to destroy. I am here to tell you that I will not bow, I will not break." The room erupted, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. The farmer stood tall, answering each one with calm strength, his story spilling into the world, not just a story of one man, but of many who had been silenced, betrayed, crushed. But even as hope flickered in the crowd, a shadow lingered at the edge of the hall. The man in gray, watching, his eyes burning, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the railing as the farmer's voice spread beyond the walls. The man's whisper lost beneath the noise, but heavy with promise. "This ends soon. Part 5 ends here, with truth unleashed but danger looming closer than ever. The final confrontation waiting at the edge of dawn." The farmer's voice echoed through the press hall long after the questions ended. The papers spread before the cameras, the truth laid bare for the world to see. When he finally stepped back, silence held for only a breath before the room erupted, journalists shouting over each other, flashes exploding like lightning. The story had left his lips and entered the air, unchained beyond their grasp. The woman in black touched his arm, her eyes steady. "You did it," she whispered, but her voice carried no relief, only warning, because she knew, as he knew, that truth had a price. When they returned to the farmhouse, the sky was heavy with clouds pressing low, the land still scarred by fire. The neighbors who once smiled now lingered at fences, their faces uncertain, watching as though waiting for the ground to shift. The farmer ignored them, his gaze fixed ahead, his wife by his side, his son clinging close. That night the storm came not from the sky but from the road, engines again rolling, heavy gravel crunching, headlights cutting through the dark, more cars than before, black silhouettes moving like predators. The farmer rose from the table, his wife's hand clutching his sleeve, fear in her eyes. He kissed her forehead, once whispered, "Stay inside," then stepped out into the night. The cars lined along the fence, men spilling out, their faces hard, their movements sure at the front. The man in gray stepped forward, his smile sharp, though his eyes burned with fury. "So you think your little speech will change anything?" he said. "You think truth is stronger than power?" The farmer stood in the yard, shotgun steady, though lowered, his voice calm, steady. "I do not think it, I know it." The man in gray sneered, then raised his hand, and his men spread out, circling, closing like wolves. One of them shouted, "You should have stayed in the dirt, farmer. The sky is not for you." The others laughed, low, cruel, their boots crunching on the gravel. But then from the road came other lights, other engines, not of polished sedans but of trucks, tractors, pickups, neighbors arriving one by one, some with faces still uncertain, but others hard with resolve. They lined along the road, their headlights flooding the yard, their presence heavy, silent. The woman in black stepping forward from one of the trucks, her voice sharp enough, "No more," she said. The man in gray froze, surprise flashing across his face as more figures stepped from the trucks, cameras again, journalists who had followed the farmer's story, reporters raising lenses, recording every breath. The trap had been set, not by violence but by truth carried in plain sight. The farmer lifted his shotgun now, higher, his voice carrying across the yard. "You came to break me, but you have already lost, because I am not alone anymore." The man in gray's smile faltered, his men shifting uneasy under the glare of lights. The eyes of witnesses, one of the neighbors shouted loud enough for all to hear, "Leave him be." His words cracked but strong. Another voice followed, then another, until the night filled with shouts, not laughter but defiance. The tide turned before their eyes. The man in gray's face twisted with rage, his hand shaking as he pointed at the farmer. "You will regret this," he hissed. "You will regret every word." But even as he spoke, his men began to pull back, their courage bleeding out beneath the weight of eyes and cameras. The power of secrecy stripped away. The cars retreated one by one, engines growling, fading into the night, until only silence remained, heavy but alive. The neighbors lingered, watching the farmer, some nodding slightly, others standing still, but none turning away. The farmer lowered the shotgun, his chest rising heavy, his eyes closing for a moment, then opening to the sky above the clouds. Breaking just enough for stars to shine, faint but true, his wife stepped out, her arms wrapping around him, his son pressed against his side, the woman in black standing near, her face weary but fierce. "You are not finished." Yet she said quietly, "They will come again in courts, in whispers, in shadows, but they will not win, not now, not ever." The farmer nodded, his jaw steady, his voice quiet but strong. "Then let them come, because I will not bow." Days turned 2 weeks, and though battles still came, though rumors still spread, though papers still questioned, the tide had shifted, the story carried across. Towns, cities, borders, people who had never heard his name now spoke of him, not as a farmer chasing an impossible dream, but as a man who stood when they told him to kneel. And when the day finally came, when the jet gleamed once more under the sun, waiting at the runway, the farmer walked toward it, not with fear, not with anger, but with calm, his wife and son beside him, the woman in black following close, the steps of his boots steady, the air thick with the scent of fuel and promise. He paused at the base of the stairs, his hand resting on the rail, his eyes lifting to the sky, endless, wide, unforgiving yet free. He thought of his father's voice, "Never stop dreaming." He thought of the fire, the lies, the betrayal. He thought of the faces that tried to crush him, and the faces that stood to raise him. And he knew the journey was more than a flight. It was a declaration. He climbed the steps, each one a victory, each one a defiance. He reached the door, his son's voice ringing, "Father, we will fly." He smiled, truly smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Yes," he said, "we will fly." And as the engines roared and the jet lifted from the ground, cutting through the air, the world below grew smaller. The fields, the roads, the scars left behind fading into distance. The sky opened wide, endless, and waiting. The farmer sat back, his hands steady, his heart calm, his eyes on the horizon, where clouds parted to reveal sunlight, pure and strong. He whispered softly, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for himself, "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you really are." The jet climbed higher, the world below silent, the sky before him endless, and for the first time in his life, he was not running, he was not bowing, he was free. Story ends here, with flight born not of privilege but of struggle, with freedom carved not from gifts but from fire, and with truth rising higher than any storm could reach the end.